Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zahran. Thank you, as always, for tuning in for another episode of the show. Today, I want to talk about a team I used to be around all the time, and I'm no longer around them, the Detroit Pistons, who, coming off a second-round playoff exit after being the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, have had a lot of questions, mainly around their center, Jalen Duren. And the contract situation with Duren, which is still at a standstill as we record today, has fascinated me because the player thinks he's worth something, the team doesn't really agree, and there's an impasse. And no one really has swooped in to offer Duren that money, so it leads to a different type of conversation there. So to talk about this and some Detroit Pistons all-up stuff is my good friend, Jonathan Powell. John, how you doing, man?
Great, man. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so a little bit of background. Jonathan has been a Pistons fan the entirety of his existence.
Going on 39 years, yeah.
Yeah, so when I lived in Detroit, we would go to Pistons games all the time, and most infamously, we were at Little Caesars Arena when LeBron James and Isaiah Stewart got into a fight. So that'll also always be a core memory for me of when I lived in Detroit. But we kind of want to.
That was
Never.
Yeah.
That was an incredible, because it's real quick. It's so funny about that is because I've talked to you about this before, but my whole reason for going to that game was I always regretted never seeing Kobe live, during his career. And I was like, I got to see LeBron live once because up until that moment I hadn't. And I was just like, oh, they're coming to town. He's in LA. He's in the West now. So this is my only chance. I don't know when he's going to retire, so look, come and find out, I only got to see a half of LeBron basketball because he got thrown out before in the second quarter. So, but that's the way it shakes sometimes.
Top 5 LeBron moments of all time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. With the running the Hall of Fame montage, that's what they're going to put on up there. Like, hey, remember that regular season game in Detroit when you got into a fight with Beef Stew? That was awesome. So, Jonathan, talk about Duren. I remember when he was drafted. Specifically, I remember because there was some trade shenanigans with the Knicks that night that kind of diverted that pick to Charlotte and then eventually diverted to Detroit. And Duren, throughout this regular season, he really popped. And he kind of emerged as this sort of building block for the future for the Pistons. And like we've talked about this before, his attitude just kind of felt very of the city. He felt very like, no one believes in me. I'm going to win with toughness. I'm going to be, this, imposing presence on the block. And, he played incredibly well, got an all-NBA nod, which made him eligible for a max extension. But come playoff time, some may say it was the curse of Wendell Carter Jr. Others have other thoughts, but he wasn't the same player, which happens to a lot of guys, right? He's not the only guy this has ever happened to. Like the guy I think of immediately with this is Julius Randle, right? Like he was like that. He had an awesome regular season with the Knicks, came a nobody in the playoffs. Happens all the time. Moments a little bit too big.
Certainly, Harden gets that reputation.
Harden has that reputation, right? Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of guys.
Paul George.
Yeah, so many, right? So this isn't like a unique situation. But after the performance in the playoffs, do you think that the perception of him as a big building block foundational piece of this organization has changed?
He's a bum. Be gone.
Get him
Be
out of
gone
here.
with him. He's done. No. Honestly, you talked about when he was drafted. I fell, or that when we got him at, I think, was it 13 in that draft? We were stoked. I was like, well, this kid's raw, but he's an athlete. Like, he'll learn, and he had just ascended this year. Like we didn't know he had it in him yet, and it came out. I mean, averaging 19 and a half and 10 during the season. He was a monster. I mean, he was a true rim protector. He looked like he could potentially be a true staple or cornerstone duo with Cade, going to the future. And that could still be true, but the lights were a little too bright in the postseason, and I think that matters. It kind of like he got played off the court by Paul Reed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get me wrong, I love B-ball Paul, that's my boy. But when you get played off the court by your third string center, when you ask for a max contract, it kind of throws some cold water on it, I suppose.
Would you say that it was really just the nerves got to him, the moment got to him, or because like during the season, like I had written an article about him, I was like, hey, he has like Bam Adebayo potential here if he could unlock a corner three. And he looked nothing like Bam, right, in the postseason. So was it just a mental thing, or do you think there's a skill set issue where he's not really a playoff guy?
Yeah, no, he looked more like Greg Monroe. So we've seen this
Oh,
act
good
before.
pull. Good pull. Yeah.
But that was kind of my issue with like guys like Monroe and Drummond. They were good players early, but they never like they reached their peak within 2 or 3 years and never got better. I mean, until all of a sudden now Andre Drummond's shooting threes. Cool, okay, but that was kind of our frustration with both those guys is they never found a way to evolve their game or change, and so they were just the same guy, expensive rebounder essentially, which what I called Drummond. But that was kind of our fear with this guy. But then this year he was able to have at least kind of a mid-range jumper in there here and there. He did expand his game. He was a true offensive weapon. I mean, averaging almost 20 and 10. I'm not sure. I'm no analyst. I don't know how many guys do that in the league, but that's a true NBA, center. It's just is it worth it to pay a guy like that as that much money to be essentially kind of a paint anchor? He got exposed on the perimeter a lot. So we're just gonna get another Drummond, then no, it's not worth it.
Yeah, during the regular season, you mentioned like his mid range, his pick and pop was just excellent because Cade just demands so much gravity as a primary initiator that when you get the pick and roll running with him, he could kind of slide out free throw line and just hit that pretty consistently. And in the playoffs, it just disappeared. Now you could say part of that is scheme and maybe the matchup with Orlando was bad, but and maybe the matchup with Cleveland also bad. I don't know, but it just kind of like it felt like he just like wasn't the same guy, and again that happens a lot where the playoffs are harder. You're the key focus, and you're the second most important guy on the team, but it shouldn't come to the point where you're getting played off the court. And Paul Reed is a much more viable option. Again, no disrespect to Paul Reed, but if you're talking about a guy like who's supposed to be a max level contributor, that's a big issue. So it seems like the disconnect here, right, is Duren is like, well, I made all NBA. I'm 20 and 10. Who else are you guys going to go ahead and get? You need to pay me the max. And the team's like, well, hold on a second. Yeah, you're a max level regular season player, but it seems like you're not really like that in the playoffs. So do you think the player's right or the team's right here?
I mean, obviously, this is where it all gets messy, right? I mean, the last I heard, Duren was asking for over 280 mil, I think, for 5 years. Because, like you said, because All NBA, unlocked those numbers, if you will. And from his side, he's 22 years old. He put up elite regular season numbers. He's seen some other traditional or whatever, flood bigs getting bags. So, but from the front, and this is what every fan base does to every player, no matter what. It's like no one's, we blame the guy for wanting to just get as much money as possible, which is what every player on every team is trying to do. But of course, like when it comes to like our guy, it's like, no, frankly, I've never seen this town turn so fast on someone. I can't remember something like this happening. And we've all been trying to answer that same question of like, what happened? Where did he go? And I don't think anyone's had a good answer. He just disappeared. It was strange. It was but from the front office perspective, I suppose, like I said, you don't really want to be handing out max adjacent or full rookie max contracts to a guy who, couldn't play. Like you literally couldn't put him on the floor in a high level playoff situation. So honestly, I trust Trajan Langley. I think he's great. I think he's smart, but I think they're probably right to hesitate here. And you said the team doesn't believe in him, but I'd say the league doesn't believe in him because they let him go search. Like, okay, go search around, and it's crickets. So
yeah, I mean the Lakers were rumored. They went ahead and signed Walker Kessler instead. Which Kessler has a benefit of the fact that he hasn't had to be in the playoff series. Where to show whether he would show up in that moment because he played for the Jazz.
Yeah.
The Kings were in the running there. I mean, you mentioned that you never seen a player get turned on by the city so fast. I mean, why do you think they are turning on him?
It's exactly the point I was just saying about how we just do this to our athletes. It's like you want your guy to be your guy, but the moment they just go for the money, you're like, "This guy's a jerk. Get him out of here." It's that. It's this. I just think that's what fan bases do, and you know, I guess Tom Brady, maybe took some less money. I guess LeBron technically maybe is taking less. There's a lot of examples of that, but you can't blame a 22-year-old for trying to get his as much money as he can. That's what every player does. So. I just
Yeah,
think that's just that fan, angst. And you know what? We've just, we've slugged through several years of just bottom feeding basketball, and this messy stalemate is just an annoyance of like we want to move on, like with this franchise. Like obviously we had that somewhat tragic exit from the playoffs. So it's like, let's go, let's move, let's go on to the next thing. I loved our draft, like, and now we're just stuck in this, and it's all we're hearing about, and it's not good for anyone.
yeah, it's one thing when you're a star guy like Wembanyama, he took a little bit less than the full max. Obviously Jalen Brunson took less than the full max. LeBron has taken discounts, especially when he went to Miami to make that happen. When you're the main guy, you could probably do that, and you could probably recoup some of that on the endorsement side. Cade has a shoe coming out with Nike soon, so like he could do that if he wanted to. Duren, I feel like there's probably I liken it a little bit, not as much money obviously, but a little bit to the Knicks Mitchell Robinson thing, where like yeah he could have taken less and stayed in New York, but big guys like that, you don't know what the health's going to be long term. You don't know like how the game changes, how valuable you're going to be. So you want to cash in when you could cash in. Just that center position has just evolved in so many different ways and tentacles over the last decade. You just don't know. So if you're Duren, you probably want to maximize that contract, and I'm not going to fault him for that. I'm always going to be on the side of the player. Like yeah, go ahead. Team owner who makes $1 billion, you go into the first or second apron, like, but I also, from a team building perspective, I get the caution that the Pistons are using because teams are treating the second apron like a hard cap unless you're the Cavs. They're the only team that's like willingly going into the second apron and not caring. But it does minimize a lot of what you can do, not just from a pay thing. I don't care about that, right? Let an owner pay extra money for a roster. Who gives a shit? But when it comes to like losing draft picks, making trades more difficult, yeah, that's hard for team building, right? So uh, I want to get back to the difference in between Duren's playoff performance and his regular season performance. So if the Pistons were a play-in team last year, with same stats and everything for Duren, and let's say they go like Charlotte and they're bouncing the play-in game, right? And people would say, well, what a great foundation to build off of. You got Cade and you got his big man sidekick, 20 and 10. They're set for the future. But because they got into the playoffs and he had 2 bad series, it's kind of like, well, this guy's a bum. He's not worth any money. Whereas in that hypothetical play-in scenario, they probably do extend him at the max number. If they were like the 7 seed and got bounced in the play-in game or something, right? So is he kind of becoming a little bit of almost like a case study on, well, if you want to really get paid, it really only matters what you do in the postseason. Any award you get in the regular season, any accolades there, kind of irrelevant. All we care about is that performance in the postseason.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but fans love to blame it only on the playoffs, right? But I'm sure any analyst or insider would tell you the truth. And you mentioned the CBA stuff. I mean, I don't know all the rules, but it's a straitjacket. You can see how terrified teams are of going into that. And so I don't think that, like I said, I like Langdon. I think he's smart. And I don't think he's obviously not evaluating Duren in a vacuum. He's looking at a future where Cade's making massive money. There's going to be other young pieces that need extensions. Then if that roster flexibility becomes nearly impossible once you do cross those tax thresholds, however it works, committing $50 million a year to a center who isn't a certified top tier superstar or scorer even kind of locks you out of making any other crucial moves. So we either need to, I don't know, come to some kind of contract agreement, maybe a couple. I don't know how this works because I don't claim to be an expert on NBA salary cap or contracts, but otherwise, it's time to we have to pivot. It's the writing's on the wall.
So from a skill set perspective, like what's the ideal situation of him to unlock? So right now we have a rim protecting, rim running center. decent screen setter, not much of a shooting game, although he's added mid-range. To really kind of elevate him, like you said, into the upper echelon of bigs in this league, is it just a simple, like, develop a three-point shot? Is it develop some off-the-dribble capability? Like, what would he need to kind of take that next step forward?
Yeah. Like I said, he's just doesn't quite fit that offensive archetype. And
Yeah.
if you want to maximize Cade's window, he's a legitimate superstar, potentially top 10, 15, player in the league. Obviously, first team All NBA this past season. Do we need a dynamic, vertical threat like Duren? In theory, sure. You mentioned the pick and roll chemistry. That can be
Mhm.
lethal. I mean, but I suppose kind of modern playoff basketball demands more versatility. Bigs who can switch, protect the rim consistently, stretch the floor, shoot, not get exposed on the perimeter. And so if his ceiling is limited to being that paint-bound center who struggles when the game slows down, that's when you kind of have to ask if that profile is really what going to maximize Cade's prime.
That leads me into my next question, which is about Cade. So, Cade, for as much as you hate me making this comparison, he's a very heliocentric point guard, Harden-esque in that way in terms of usage.
When did I say
Obviously,
that?
listen, Pistons fans don't like Cade being compared to Harden the same way Mavs fans, when they
Oh,
had Luka, didn't like
eh,
didn't like Luka being compared to Harden. But in terms of a
yeah.
usage rate profile, it's similar, right? The offense, anything that happens for the Pistons on offense happens through Cade, and that's by necessity. My biggest critique of this team is that they haven't prioritized a secondary on-ball creator. They thought they had that with Jaden Ivey, but then he went off the rails, right? But no need to get into that. So is the idea here that, like, well, we don't mind paying a lot of money for a second star. The problem is Duren doesn't fit the profile of the second star, where they need, like, when Michael Porter Jr. was available, should they have, gone that route and tried to get somebody like him, somebody who could take some of Cade's usage down? Like, you think about, to use a Luka example, when they acquired Kyrie in Dallas, that was huge for him because Kyrie was able to handle the ball in certain situations, right? Do you think that's what the Pistons need, that they're thinking we need to prioritize an on-ball creator more so than an elite level defensive and rebounding big?
Certainly, and I think that was obvious all season. We kinda got away with it during the regular season. I mean, 60 wins is 60 wins, and, I think we beat your team by 90 points, but,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
no, but,
it's
um,
true. Yeah, in the regular
uh,
season, it was great. It was
but
insane, honestly. It honestly pissed
but
me off
yeah,
how badly it was happening, and I was just like, "Man,
uh,
this team acts like they wanna be legit, and, here's a top team in the East, they're getting smoked." And I was just like, "This is not good,"
yeah,
So, but yeah.
and I'm sending you screenshots, from the stands being like, "I'm here.
Yeah, I
Look at
remember that,
this.
yeah,
You
for sure.
watching?"
And you knew I
Um,
was, that's the thing.
yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think we as Pistons fans, watching this team, we kind of saw it in the team. Like we knew there wasn't another scorer. We knew. I mean, I love Duncan Robinson, but he's not that. He's not it. And there, we just did. We was mostly just it was Cade and Duren, and Duren's not a shooter, so it was left to Cade to kind of facilitate everything. And then when we needed a big shot, it was either he had to do something at the end of the clock, or rely on one of those guys on the outside. I mean, Karis LeVert, I mean, to make shots, and then we saw it get exposed in the playoffs quickly. And so we have been seeing it and wanting it and talking about it as fans all year long, that we would do anything for another dynamic scorer or wing, somebody, an actual sidekick to Cade. And if it means sacrificing Duren to do it, let's do it. I think that'd be the sentiment of most fans at this point.
I feel like there's a reckoning coming for this Pistons roster build, where you could have one non-shooter on the floor. Typically in the modern NBA, that's fine. But the starting lineup has two, right? Ausar Thompson, also a non-shooter. So I would argue that you could probably cobble together decent enough rim protection, but wing defenders like Ausar Thompson don't grow on trees, right? We've saw, like, throughout this playoffs, teams that had those elite wing defenders were the teams that won playoff games, right? You think about uh, OKC with like Jalen Williams, right? And Kason Wallace and those type of defenders. San Antonio with Steph Castle. These are the type of players that you deploy to, lock teams up and to try and neutralize elite scoring threats on the other side. And Ausar is that. I've made the argument that when you look at his statistics defensively, he actually had a better season than his brother in Houston did, and which is crazy to think because he's always perceived as the inferior twin. But this past year, I think it was a lot closer than people admit. So, I mean, do you think that the Pistons should prioritize Ausar because his contract's coming up pretty soon over somebody like Duren? You look at Kessler; his deal was around $32 million per year. Duren seems like he's not going to accept that sort of a number. So at that point, do you just try to play out this year, see maybe you flip him at the deadline, to some contender who needs somebody? Has it gotten that bad where we're at a point, you know what, just wash our hands of this, prioritize Cade plus Ausar, and then bring in another scorer down the line?
Yeah, talking about Ausar, that he's a polarizing player amongst everybody I talk to. I mean, it's
So
either
tell me about that because I love watching the guy. I understand
yeah,
the shooting is a problem. Maybe this is like Knicks fan in me because I love Josh Hart so much. And Josh has developed a shot. Don't get me wrong.
yeah.
So it's not quite Ausar, but this guy is just like a menace defensively, crazy on the break, and has developed into a relatively decent passer as well. So, what's the perception of him among Pistons fans?
Yeah, I mean, most of my closest friends or my circle, we love the guy and we love watching him play. But of course, it is frustrating at times, like because we know he's got that in him. He is an elite defender, I mean, especially on the perimeter. Um, and listen, he's young. I think he's incredibly athletic. I mean, it's not too late to teach this man to shoot. It could happen. So, um, I think most fans would definitely wanna prioritize him, keep him here, and if he can develop an offensive game, then, now you got a real, sidekick, a real duo of 1-2 that maybe could take you to, the finals.
I think about because everything I somehow managed to tie it back to the Knicks, so I apologize. But a lot
Oh,
of times this
love it.
past year, Mike Brown kind of deployed some situational small ball lineups with OG Anunoby at the five. And, OG about 6'8", so, right in that Ausar ballpark. I think Ausar maybe a little bit shorter than that, but the way the game's played now, you could probably get away with that with the right configuration around him, and I I feel like maybe Duren clogs up that idea. Now, Isaiah Stewart's gone. He also had clogged up that idea as well. But but I just wonder, if that's a direction that they go in, and which leads me to this second apron thing, right? Because if you're paying Duren a max contract, that's gonna gobble up 25-30% of your cap sheet. And I guess it's like, is this just the Pistons just saying, you know what, man, great player. We love having him here. Great culture piece, all the whole nine. But we just can't justify giving him 30% of the cap in addition to whatever Cade's getting towards the cap. So half of your salaries. I mean, this is the Boston problem, right? The reason they traded Jalen Brown because him and Tatum were eating up half the cap sheet. So is it just simply that we just can't justify using the cap on this player who hasn't even shown that he could do anything in the playoffs?
Yeah, you mentioned it, I think the league has kind of somewhat evolved past that era of the, um obviously, the traditional non-shooting, paint clogging powerhouse center, right, obviously, but it's kind of funny how some that it's kinda swung back that way. I mean, you look
Yes.
at guys like, I guess, Holmgren or Wemby, even I mean, and Jokic even, like, as a centerpiece big man and not the same type archetype, if you will, but unless you have somebody like that, you know, then I think it kinda hurts him. You know, it kind of puts a ceiling on how much value that he can really provide if his play style is kind of dead and continues to get exposed and just outplayed by his own teammates, I guess.
Yeah, that skill set seems to have a limit, right? Where it seems to where it's just kind of like a a sort of archetype that has a limit on what it can be offered from a salary cap perspective. Whereas like, yeah, 15, 20 million a year is probably the threshold cap, and here's Duren scoffing at 25. So, it's like a supply and demand situation, right? I want to pivot to the current regime front office. You mentioned Trajan Langdon a couple times, which, if memory serves, when I was a kid, when he was a player, I believe he was on the cover of one of the college basketball video games, like in the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But what's the favorability of this regime right now? Because from the outside looking in, I'm maddening. It's maddening to watch them because I'm just like, I'm waiting for them to make a splash in the offseason, free agency trade, whatever, because the limitations were clear. Cade needed help. It reminds me a lot of early LeBron in Cleveland, where he's just like cobbling it up together and could only get but so far. And what do? They re-sign Kevin Huerter and they bring in John Collins. And I was like, that's it? So what's the read on what this team is doing? Is it just simply they're being patient and you got to trust the process, or are they really missing some great opportunities to upgrade the talent of this roster?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think right now, Langdon and the rest of the front office, sure, they have a massive reservoir of sorts of goodwill
Mhm.
because they did build a 60-win team. They got the number one seed. I mean, Detroit fans have been starving for competence and winning basketball again. And this regime delivered a massive turnaround, a massive. What was it, 2 seasons ago, or 14 wins, and we turned that into 60, and we were seeing an actual future. You know, so that said, how this Duren resolution plays out, whether it's a team friendly bridge deal, excuse me, whether it's a team friendly bridge deal or a max extension or even a tough trade, I think that will probably be the defining test of their tenure.
Yeah, I part of me wants to say, okay, you got to be patient. You have to kind of build the right way, and don't panic and make a trade or whatever. But I also think I was like, there's the East is so fluid right now. So many parts are moving and everything. Like the time to strike is now, right? There is no San Antonio and OKC in the East, right? Like, yes, the Knicks won a title, but the Sixers just acquired a bunch of people. Miami is new. A lot of these teams are like, Indiana's going to be back, but there is no real clear defined, wow, this is a juggernaut in the conference team, right? And so it's it just make me wonder is like, are they being maybe playing it a little too safe, and don't be so precious on some of these assets that you have. Maybe when somebody becomes available, you kind of jump after it, and they haven't really done that. And to your point, like the Pistons fans, they've been waiting for a winner for a long time. They've gone through some really dark ages here in this past decade, and it's turned around, and, JB Bickerstaff has been awesome as a coach, and it's just kind of like, you got to give him something more to work with here, because it's just going to be tough when you're just relying on Cade to save the day every single time. That's not that NBA anymore. This isn't 2001 when Allen Iverson could do that, right? It's just like you need a second scorer. It just the way it is, right? It's just like I'll bring up the Knicks on their title run again. Like why was it different this time? It's because you had Cat and he was unlocked in a certain playmaking aspect. OG Anunoby became a much more impactful scorer. Like you need those secondary guys to do it. You can't just rely on like, oh, maybe Ron Holland will develop. It's just like I like Ron Holland, but it's just kind of like you need a legit second guy, and I think you're leaving a little meat on the bone there.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, 3 weeks into free agency, I mean, we're still in this stalemate, right?
yeah,
Where
yeah.
I look at the East, and I think we're sitting here watching all these other teams get better, and we're just like, okay, well,
What do we do?
Puka's gonna be
Yeah.
cool, right? Like, watching his Stanford highlights just to be like, feel something. But yeah, it's just a matter of after finally tasting 60 wins and top seed, and the bar has just fundamentally changed now. We're not happy to be here anymore. Let me ask you, after the playoffs were over, despite the obvious flaws that caused us to, lose, I still would have considered the Pistons one of the top 4 teams in the East, like, after
Mm,
that, regardless. I mean,
sure.
so, would you have thought that after the season?
Uh,
Or
let's
do you
see.
think that our team got so exposed that it like, that alone kind of would drop us down as far as how you think of the team in general?
I mean, I would probably say they were like I felt like Cleveland showed they had a higher ceiling with the scoring options with Mitchell and Harden and whatever Mobley can be. I think the Knicks offered more depth and more scoring versatility. So I think those two, I think that those two teams being in the conference finals made a lot of sense. But I think the Pistons would be third right after that. So yeah, I still think they were a top 4 team in the East. You can't discount a talent like Cade. That's the thing, right? Like whether you like when you look at the guards in the East, it's 4 guys to me. It's Cade, Brunson, Maxey, and when he gets back from injury, Tyrese Halliburton. So those are like the guys, that are just like they're pillars of a franchise in their own way, and you can't discount that. Like as much as I like Paolo Banchero, he's not there yet. He's not that kind of guy. And so you can't dismiss it. And that's why I'm thinking like you have that foundation and you surround him with John Collins. Now I'm a noted John Collins skeptic, but like on paper, he's one of those guys like, oh yeah, stretch big. He could kind of like as a power forward, he could kind of, get you some shots from outside. But he's just one of those guys who felt like a bad culture fit too. He doesn't seem like a Detroit guy.
But he
And
was always a guy I would get on my, NBA 2K team
for
because
sure,
you could trade for him and he was cheap. Loved him.
yeah, yeah.
2K legend, John
2K
Collins.
legend, exactly. But, it's just like when I think of a Detroit guy, and we've talked about this before or went off, I think of guys, ironically, with a similar mentality of somebody like Duren, where, they're not afraid to do the dirty work, they embody the city and that sort of thing. And that's what really sells and works in Detroit. And John Collins doesn't feel like that kind of guy for me. Cade is that kind of guy. He's shown to be able to work from adversity. Ron Hollins is that type of guy. Beef Stew is that type of guy. Now he gets to apply that same craft in Memphis, which is a hand in glove fit. Another city that really appreciates that kind of a player. So I just
I
think
miss him
that,
already. I
yeah,
miss him
yeah.
already. I love Beef Stew. That was our boy.
I think there's something to be said about team culture. And which is why I'm a little hesitant on this way this Duren stuff has gone, because I do think he embodies team culture really well. Him and Stewart had that whole like junkyard dog thing or whatever going in the middle of the season. I can't remember what it was exactly, but they really kind of bought into it. And when you buy into it, that makes things easier. So they got to figure it out. And you mentioned Wemby and Holmgren before. I feel like they've kind of wrecked the curve for a guy like Duren, because now you're expecting a guy to be that. If you're a max big, you got to be able to create on the outside in some way, and that's just not who he is. The one outlier is Bam, but Bam has increased his offensive profile, and Duren hasn't done that yet. With that said, I want to close out here on just expectations. So we kind of talked about the Pistons as a whole. There's been a lot of change in the East. Now, what are you expecting from them this coming year?
Like, define expecting, because me, I'm also, I'm a diehard fan, and I would never claim to be an insider, an analyst. I just love this team, right? But expectations is like, what are you saying? How far should I think they will go, or what is the expectation of like the fan base for what would be considered a successful season?
I guess we could go both ways, right? So where do you expect them to end up? Do you think they have a conference finals or finals run in them? And secondly, what would be considered a successful season? Obviously, the goal is to win the championship, no doubt about that. But what would you consider success from them this coming season?
Well, like I said, after the season, I thought like, we were right there. It felt like, I mean, I think we lost in game 6, so weren't that close, but um, we had a taste of it again. The Eastern Conference Finals were right there,
Hmm.
and I'm still bummed that our teams didn't get to run into each other. That would have been fun. But, like I said, we're not just happy to be here anymore. The rebuilding phase is officially over. So, I would have said that expectation 3 weeks ago, I would have said expectations are championship, or at least like Eastern Conference Finals is what I meant. Uh, Basically that or bust. And, we expect Cade to play at an MVP level again. We expect a growth from the supporting cast. Like, can Ausar level up again? Is Holland ready yet? Are we? If we end up with Duren, have we alienated him in some way? Is that going to be a problem? But like I said, I just sat around these last 3 weeks and watched the rest of the East get better, and so I would have told you like, yeah, Eastern Conference Finals or bust. But now I'm like, 6 seed.
Yeah, I mean, when you really look at it, so obviously, so the Knicks mostly retained their team as is, with the exception of Mitchell Robinson. You downgrade there by going to Andre Drummond, but I still think that's a top 4 team in the East, regardless. The Sixers obviously are the big headline. They got a lot better, and still a little bit of depth issues, but they also feel like a top 4 team. But then you have like a couple unknowns, right? Like, Milwaukee and Brooklyn are going to be bad. Chicago's going to be in that play-in mix more than likely or below. Charlotte is getting better, so they feel like a potential riser. Miami just got Giannis. You can't discount that, as much as I am worried about the injuries and that sort of thing. But Indiana being back with a healthy Halliburton kind of complicates things to me, because they were just kind of written off last year because they didn't have Halliburton. They were the worst team in the conference, whatever. And they had Zubac and Halliburton kind of together, in addition to all their other players. So they feel like they'll be there. I feel like a top 5 seed isn't out of the question for the Pistons, but um, I'd be a little concerned, right? Because like a lot of these teams have gotten better, and uh, Boston's a little weird, right? Because now they don't have Brown. How healthy is Paul George going to be? But they also win a million regular season games every year. So, like, you can't really discount them, really. So I feel like 4, 5, 6, depending on how like Orlando and Indiana do this year. That feels right about there. Now, if Cade has an explosion statistically, even beyond what he was doing last year, and really cements himself as like an MVP top 3 front runner, the conversation changes, right? But, I feel like he was a little slighted in that last year, in the MVP conversation. Usually the top option on a number 1 seed team gets a little more love than that, but, it's it's difficult, man. The East is like not necessarily better at the top, but deeper than the West, I think, right? Where there's really only a couple bad teams. Like, what are the Wizards going to be this year? That's going to be no cakewalk, with Anthony Davis and Trae Young, assuming they're healthy, and DeBonsa and Sar and all these guys. So the Wizards are going to try to be in the play-in, So that's the thing. I don't think there's going to be a ton of 60-win teams next year, because this draft lottery change has made it infinitely less desirable to be a bottom 3 team. So, that game in February between Brooklyn and Utah, is going to be a lot more competitive than it used to be, which should be interesting. But, it'll be fascinating to see. I mean, do you think if they take a step back that there'll be pressure to make some sweeping changes? Like, let's say they're a 7 seed, right? And they don't really, advance in any sort of way from a structure perspective. Do you think that any players, coaches, whatever, will be on the hot seat?
Well, I like Bickerstaff. He obviously turned things around in a big way, so really like him. And I've talked about Langdon for sure, but I mean, I suppose if this Duren thing goes wrong, if we end up a 7 seed or something like that, I mean, that would be an abject failure as far as I'm
Right,
concerned.
right.
Really, I joked about 6 seeds. I didn't mean to dodge your question, by the way. I hope my answer wasn't a cop out, but um, I I think, as I said, like this whole Duren thing will be kind of the defining moment of Langdon's time here. And if he screws this up, then it's going to be his head probably. And he has to prove that the team has to prove that the 60-win season wasn't a fluke.
Right. I mean, how do you think the Duren thing ends out? Do you think they end up keeping him, or they figure out a new home, sign and trade? So what do you think? What do you
You're
think
gonna
is the
make me
resolution?
you're gonna make me have a take on you, aren't you?
Yeah, gotta do it. Had to be done.
You know what? What I would really love is to let's just move on. I mean, frankly,
Hmm.
we've been talking about getting a wing. We've been talking about having that other scorer alongside Cade. Let's just do it already. If we're gonna sit here and haggle over $50 million a year for our center, then what are we doing? Let's move on. We know he's valuable. I don't know when his value would be at its peak. I don't know if it's now or say in the middle of the season if he's playing well, right? If we ended up keeping him, but at this point, I'm like, I again, like we are so ready to just go, and this is really devastating to the momentum that we thought we had.
Hmm. Is there any player that
Oh,
you
I
would
didn't
kind
answer the
of?
question. I think I think he's gonna end up staying with Detroit.
Okay. Do you think is there any player out there that you would say, you know what, if we could kind of facilitate a trade and get him instead, is there anybody that you would be interested in, or is that maybe too broad of a question without thinking about it too hard?
I haven't spent a lot of time in the
And
trade
trade machine.
machine, MG trade machine in a while. So
The trade machine kind of sucks now with all the aprons. I'm not gonna lie to you because like you used to be able to cook with it a little bit, and now it's just kind of like you got to really refine it and do the salary matching. The second apron and first apron have made it so much more
yeah,
challenging. Um, I almost wonder, if not saying that they're going to make this trade happen, but it feels like De'Aaron Fox is kind of on in the outs in San Antonio, and because of how big of a guard Cade is, I almost wonder if that becomes a somewhat interesting pairing. Because Fox is a big contract; it's like 50 some odd million. But he's a guy who was just part of a finals run, and maybe that's something you could take the usage load off of Cade, but then you also got to figure out another center. So it's tough. I almost feel like maybe they just tried and ride it out the season and flip him at the deadline, and then let him deal with free agency in the offseason. But if you had told me back in January, hey, guess what? There's going to be a contract dispute between the Pistons and Jalen Duren. And I'll be like, what do you mean? Because he felt like he was such a core piece to what they're trying to build. And now it's just gone completely sideways. So we'll see how it goes, man. These things have a funny way of working themselves out once the money gets to where the money needs to get to. I think if they go up to 40 million, that probably gets it done. He doesn't get the full 50, but the question becomes, do they really want to go to the 40 million, right? So, time will tell.
De'Aaron Fox. No, thank you. You want to swap the guy who is getting blamed for the playoff thing for the other guy who played himself off the team?
Hey,
No,
hey,
he played. He was so bad in the finals. Like he had the same story from the fan base. Like this guy stinks.
he wasn't benched though, so
Yeah.
not exactly the same story.
Yeah.
Listen, I'll say this about the Spurs. A lot of people have blamed De'Aaron Fox, and sure, but also De'Aaron Fox didn't throw the ball off Stephon Castle's back. De'Aaron Fox didn't allow OG Anunoby to get a tip in. De'Aaron Fox by himself didn't single-handedly blow a 29-point lead, in the biggest collapse in finals history, right? So also I'm just to get on my soapbox real quick, I'm tired of people like defaulting to actually the Spurs lost the finals. It wasn't that the Knicks won the finals. And I'm just like, all right, man. It's just like even when they finally actually win the title, it's still somehow, margin of victory record set aside, somehow not good enough, which is interesting to me. That's the fan in me coming out, obviously, but it is interesting to me because a lot of the conversation that I've seen online anyway, and take that with a grain of salt because of algorithms and whatnot, but it's been around like, well, Knicks got lucky, and they're lucky they caught Wemby this early in his career, and I'm just like, okay, that could be true, but you can also acknowledge like how good Brunson's game 5 was, and you can acknowledge how they just ran through the East like it was nothing, and so I don't know. It's just kind of like one of those things where, you'll never satisfy everyone, but we got the chips, so that's all that matters. But
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I haven't really felt that sentiment as much. I'm sure
yeah,
you're much more in it, so you
yeah,
see it.
right,
But
right, exactly.
I do see how it is frustrating that everyone is already like so quick to crown them as like they're next. You know what I mean? Like it's like they're like, oh, congrats on the 27 championship, the Spurs, you did it. Well, like,
Yeah,
they moved on. It just felt like everyone kinda moved on from that so quickly, and then the conversation became like, well, they were young, and they made all those mistakes like you just said. They weren't ready for the moment, but they'll be back, and so I could see that frustration, like, "Hang on a second, did you guys see that? That was one of the greatest finals runs we've ever seen. What about us?" So, I love from you ride for us, and I will always have your back too, okay? So, I won't
it's
let people
like
talk like that.
people need to remember, especially now in this second apron parity era of the NBA, making it back is far from guaranteed, right? Like everybody assumed the Thunder would be back, right? Like they're gonna break the spell. They're gonna go back to back. Jalen Williams gets an injury. Chet Holmgren disappears in a series, and the next thing you know, you're out. It's just like you never know. Everybody thought the Celtics were gonna go back to back the year before. Tatum blows his Achilles out. It's just like things happen. And the Spurs, with a guy like Wemby at his size, the way he plays, like you can't take injury out of the equation. Also, a guy like Steph Castle, how is he going to age with the style of play he has? It's just like you don't know. It's just so when you get there, you got to capitalize. That's the thing. It's look at Denver when they won their title. It's just like haven't been back to the conference finals. So it's just like you don't know. You might have those same conversations about Minnesota. They get to those conference finals 2 in a row, and weren't able to get the job done. Was that the window? That's
Milwaukee Milwaukee
Milwaukee.
comes to
Yeah,
mind too with Giannis. I mean,
every single team.
were
Yeah,
yeah, 3
every
years
single
in a
team in the
row.
2020s. That's been
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just like for me, it's like, yeah, we got our title. I'm glad we got it because if we had gotten there and lost, it would have been like you just don't know if you're ever going to be able to get back.
Yeah.
And the Knicks players are lapping it up this summer, making all these appearances, rightfully so. James Dolan's being an idiot, but it's all good.
What
Um,
else is new? And
what
I
else
love
is new?
Josh too. I love Josh Hart too, by the way. I wanna make sure I got
Well, yeah,
that's my boy.
one of the more undervalued guys in the league, I feel like, and he's the type of guy. If he's on your team, you root for him. So yeah, I got nothing but love with Josh. He was just awesome. But Jonathan, I know you were a little apprehensive about joining this podcast because you haven't done one before, but you did great, man, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, dude. This has been
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Okay. So if you enjoyed this podcast, guys, please make sure to give us a follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast app of choice. You could also check out my written pieces that is on deepcoversports.com covering all things basketball, so both the NBA and WNBA. So if you are interested in written word as opposed to podcast, you can check that out. But until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zahran, and this has been another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast.